It's finally time for this video series to talk about the Game Boy.
They said it wasn't humanly possible, but now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand.
Portable gaming was in an interesting place prior to the 90s, and wasn't as uncommon as one might think now. Anyone around my age or older will no doubt remember the LCD blackjack and poker games sitting around your grandparents' house, but even as far back as the late 70s, Mattel had introduced the Microvision, a portable LCD machine with swappable game cartridges. Not that it was terribly impressive, mind you. The screen's resolution was a measly 16 by 16 pixels. That's less than the amount of screen real estate you'd get from a Tamagotchi. Or if you prefer, a Digimon. I'm contractually obligated to mention Digimon as much as possible, so...
Oh, there it is. There it is.
And what's more, the Microvision and all these standalone LCD games were almost pathetically fragile, which kinda defeated the purpose of them being portable at all. Most manufacturers are so preoccupied with whether a portable gaming machine would be viable at all, that they never seem to stop and think about the necessary logistics to make such a thing practical in the long term. Nintendo was the company to really take the first steps to solve these issues. Their Game & Watch series of handhelds may not have had swappable game carts like the Microvision, and each game was limited to preset images burnt into their screens, but they were ergonomic and sturdy in shape and build. The earliest Game & Watch systems used a simple pair of buttons to control, but this eventually evolved into the 4-directional D-pad that's since become a mainstay for all game consoles. And in 1986, just a year after the NES had started to take hold in the States, Atari decided to try their hand at jumping back into console manufacturing, now that the video game crash of 1983 that they basically caused was apparently a thing of the past. Teaming up with longtime ally company Epyx, they came up with a portable console that would eventually be dubbed the Lynx. Its working title was the Handy, which would have been absolutely hilarious, but oh well. Released in 1987, the Lynx was a tiny titan of a machine, being designed to be played in either horizontal or vertical orientation, featuring a full-color backlit screen and a processor that put it more or less on par with the TurboGrafx 16. But the Lynx wouldn't last, in more ways than one. Not only would its library of games fail to impress nor keep the public interested, it was also just far too energy-hungry to fulfill its purpose as a portable gaming console. The thing ran on a whopping 6 AA batteries, and 6 hours was the absolute most you'd be getting out of those. Even less if you used rechargeables. At the end of the day, the Atari Lynx was basically dead on arrival, and Nintendo was no doubt taking notes. Even at the time, the Game Boy took almost everyone by surprise. Launched in 1989, the successor to the Game & Watch machines was definitely less impressive than the Lynx. But Nintendo had smartly focused on the things that mattered specifically to a handheld. Only capable of displaying 4 shades of green in blurry 8-bit pixels, the Game Boy can perhaps be best described as parts cobbled together from an NES and duct-taped to an Apple II monitor. But what the Game Boy lacked in impressive tech, it made up for in stamina. There was no doubt whether the Game Boy would last through long car rides and family vacations. It could easily last 15 hours, more than double the average of Atari's handheld, and on 2 fewer batteries to boot. Its design was also simple, comfortable, and perhaps above all else, durable. I probably don't need to show you the picture of the Game Boy that survived a bombing in a war zone and still managed to function, but I will anyway, here it is. There was no chance of this thing snapping in your pocket like the old LCD games. The name Game Boy itself was also pretty clearly a play on Sony's wildly successful Walkman, something I'm not sure Sony would have been too fond of at the time, but I'm sure that won't ultimately lead to any sort of bitter rivalry or anything, though. How crazy would that be? The Game Boy also, in all fairness, had the benefit of good timing. It was released years after the NES had taken a stranglehold of the industry, and after the Lynx had become an irrelevant dud. Had the Lynx actually managed to take off, it's very likely that the Game Boy would not have, as it was a comparatively less impressive machine. But instead, Nintendo was able to learn from Atari's failure, as well as capitalize on their own positive reputation and established IPs, to create what would be the first console in history to sell over 100 million units. The Game Boy's strong launch lineup surely helped things as well, with tennis and baseball among the titles available. But perhaps the two most important games in popularizing the Game Boy were Super Mario Land and a little puzzle game, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, it's pretty obscure, called Tetris? Tetris? I mean, it's really anyone's guess here. Now, I don't currently own any of the Game Boy launch titles. In fact, I somehow don't own any games from 1989 at all, so maybe I should have talked about this earlier just to fill that gap in my video order, but hey, better late than never, right? Those last two games in particular are historically significant enough for me to talk about them a little, just to contextualize the Game Boy a bit more. Tetris, in particular, can probably be considered the game that cemented the Game Boy's success. Everyone has played Tetris, and it's the perfect type of game for a handheld console. Addictive enough for long car rides, and yet simple and segmented enough for a waiting room or a morning bus. And Nintendo even releasing it on their console at all is the result of one of the most complex and heated legal battles in the history of video games. Nintendo fought hard to win the console rights to Tetris from Atari and Tengen, and they weren't shy about flaunting it once they had it. Casual gaming was a huge part of the Game Boy audience, and puzzle games are the darling of the casual crowd. In other words, Tetris walked so Candy Crush could run. The other notable title in the Game Boy's launch lineup is, of course, Super Mario Land, an adaptation of the classic Mario formula in a handheld form. This one was headed not by Shigeru Miyamoto and his usual gang, but rather the team at Nintendo R&D 1, led by Gunpei Yokoi, the very same team responsible for the Game Boy itself. Mario Land was a fine representation of how a Game Boy Mario could look and play. But it took a few interesting liberties, no doubt using the fact that it was a spin-off as a chance to experiment a bit. But the first Game Boy game we'll be talking about in earnest is perhaps even more fitting in retrospect. In addition to being the father of the Game & Watch and the Game Boy, Gunpei Yokoi and the R&D 1 team were also the creators of Metroid. And inevitably, the decision was eventually made to release a Metroid game for the new hit handheld. And with this, Yokoi and his team decided they weren't holding back. Whereas other NES franchises brought to Game Boy would be downsized in terms of ambition or presentation, R&D 1 decided they weren't going to compromise with Metroid. Both the Game Boy and Metroid were their babies, and they wanted to show them off. Metroid 2: Return of Samus on Game Boy wasn't a spin-off or a side story. It was a full-fledged, numbered sequel, plain as day, right there on the box. And with that alone, Yokoi's team was sending a message. They had something to prove. If the first Metroid was an homage to the film Alien, Metroid 2 was undoubtedly inspired by the film's sequel, Aliens. But instead of Ripley going to planet LV-426 to exterminate the Xenomorphs, Samus goes to planet SR-388 to exterminate the Metroids. Yes, apparently the Galactic Federation has deemed the Metroids too dangerous to be left alive, and after several attack teams are sent to the planet and unfortunately killed, Samus is hired to finish the job. A real one-woman army. Despite the dev team's apparent desire to not scale back on the scope of the first Metroid, Planet SR-388 isn't quite as complex nor labyrinthine as Planet Zebes. The game is notably more linear, and early areas are basically never revisited once you've cleared them out. Throughout the entire game, Samus's sensors detect the total number of Metroids remaining on the planet, represented by a number displayed in the corner of the screen, and she must hunt down and destroy a set quota of them in each area to be able to move on to the next. Killing every Metroid in each area will trigger a quake that lowers acid levels, allowing Samus to delve deeper into SR-388. What causes those quakes, and why do they magically trigger only when Samus destroys Metroids? Who knows? So, not only is the game more segmented and linear than the first, but also a bit contrived narratively. I suppose it makes sense for the game to be split up into portions like this, though. When it comes to handheld games, being able to play in short bursts is a big selling point. Metroid 2 now even has proper save points scattered throughout its map, so no longer do you have to memorize or write down convoluted passwords, and the game will pick up at the exact spot you saved. Not to mention, it actually remembers your energy and missile counts, so there's no need to slowly farm respawning enemies just to replenish your supply. In fact, that practice as a whole has been more or less retired, since not only will respawning enemies eventually stop appearing if you kill enough of them, but there are now energy and missile recharge stations the player can visit to instantly fill their resources. Samus is a bit more versatile this time, now being able to crouch, as well as shoot straight down, but only while she's in the air. She also begins the game with a few upgrades already equipped. This time there's no need to hunt down the Long Beam or Mari Mari, now called the Morph Ball, and she begins with a handful of missiles as well. There are still hidden energy tanks and missile expansions to increase your capacity of health and ammo, and along with the returning ice and wave beams are the new Spazer and Plasma beams. The Spazer has a wide radius and can travel through walls, traits previously assigned to the wave beam, and so the latter has been reworked to be armor-piercing to keep each beam distinct. The Plasma beam is the most powerful and can slice through multiple enemies in a row, but is an incredibly narrow shot that requires intense precision to aim successfully. All 4 of these weapons are scattered throughout the early areas, and then again placed all together in a later location, so the player is given the chance to swap between them and see which one they like best, before making the decision of which one to keep for good later on. And yeah, if the beam's effects aren't going to stack, this is the way to design this. I personally switched back to the Spazer beam because I liked its tall shot radius, but each one has their own pros and cons. There are also new Morph Ball abilities to pick up, expanding Samus's travel options. You can still use the traditional Morph Ball bomb jump, but the new Spring Ball eliminates the need, allowing Samus's ball form to jump on its own. There's also the Spider Ball, which, true to its name, allows the Morph Ball to stick to surfaces and roll along them, but will disengage if Samus takes damage. These, combined with the returning High Jump, Space Jump, and Screw Attack, give Samus more options for exploration than before. Those annoying spire, stalagmite things from the first game return, but Samus's collision has been tweaked to trigger knockback when she comes into contact with acid or lava, and the player is still able to jump when this happens, so there's no risk of being helplessly stuck in the lava this time, so neat. As Samus tracks down Metroids to kill, we see them mature through different stages, becoming more powerful and durable, with the molted shells of the base forms letting Samus and the player know that danger is near, creating a lot of tension. This not only has the terrifying implication that the most dangerous enemies from the first game were just newborns, illustrating how much of a threat these creatures truly pose, but it makes every encounter with a Metroid feel like a sort of mini-boss fight, with the different forms taking anywhere from 5 to 20 missiles to defeat. Like the first Metroid, Return of Samus is carried by its strong atmosphere. Samus is once again isolated on an alien planet, and it's clear that she isn't particularly wanted here. Metroid games would continue to excel at non-verbal environmental storytelling in the future, and Return of Samus has some great early examples of this. If this wasn't a family-friendly Nintendo game, this would likely include us seeing the dead bodies of those who came to the planet before us, but instead the game has to play things more subtly. Once Samus's sensors detect that only one Metroid remains to be slain, she follows the reading, only to find as she nears that her sensors are picking up a handful more. That's when you realize, oh shit, there's a nest. Once Samus finds herself in the Metroid nest, the game generously provides a third Ice Beam. After all, it's the only truly effective means of fighting off the juvenile Metroids. But the statue that holds the weapon has been torn to pieces and strewn throughout its chamber. It's not hard to conclude that the Metroids could tell what this weapon was and that it was a threat to them. And while they couldn't manage to destroy the weapon itself, they demolished the statue protecting it. So not only are the Metroids aggressive and numerous, but also intelligent. That's ingenious and terrifying storytelling. Also contributing to the atmosphere of Metroid 2 is the soundtrack. Outside of the main theme that plays throughout the game's early areas, the music in Return of Samus lacks any real melody and is more like ambient, unsettling noise than music in the traditional sense. It's a tactic that the original game pulled off in its final area, Torian, and the idea is expanded here. It makes travel through SR388 feel constantly tense, and given the limited amount of instruments used in these areas, it even leaves a sound channel free for us to hear Samus's footsteps, enhancing the mood further. Given the strangeness of these compositions, it's not the type of soundtrack I'd listen to in the car or anything, but in the context of the game, it works wonders. The game's graphics, unfortunately, are probably its biggest misstep. For the Game Boy, they're perfectly serviceable. There's nothing wrong with the sprite art or anything. In fact, it's all pretty detailed, and the Game Boy's lack of color meant the team had to make some changes to Samus's design that would stick throughout future games. In the first Metroid, the Varia suit was differentiated from Samus's first suit purely through color, and likewise whenever the player switched to using missiles. In Metroid 2, Samus's switch to missiles is shown via the mouth of her arm cannon opening, and to make her Varia suit stick out, it was given the wide, round shoulder pauldrons that would become an iconic visual aspect of Samus moving forward. So that stuff is all great. Unfortunately, in their attempt to show that their Game Boy was truly capable of great things, the R&D1 team perhaps grew overzealous. Samus's sprite is incredibly detailed, but it also takes up a significant portion of the screen's real estate. And in a game that revolves around exploration and interacting with your environment, this can become a real issue. Enemies can land pot shots or ambush you from just off screen, and battles with Metroids especially can be claustrophobic, and not in a way I feel is entirely intended. I have to admire Yokoi's team for being so determined to show off their game on their little handheld that could, but this ambition can and does have its downsides. Also, the black and white nature of the Game Boy combined with the game's somewhat limited tile set results in a world where a lot of the scenery is going to look very similar. It's easy to get turned around and disoriented, especially with the tiny screen space, and even with the more linear list of objectives to complete when compared to its predecessor. The acid pools that disappear when you reach each Metroid quota are not always placed in obvious or telegraphed spots, potentially leading to a lot of aimless backtracking if you forget where you're supposed to go next. While it's not a game I'd say you necessarily need a walkthrough for, looking up a set of maps is almost definitely a must. True to its inspiration, Metroid 2 ends with Samus confronting the Queen Metroid, the game's only proper boss fight, and it's not a bad one. You can choose to engage in a straightforward fight by just dumping missiles into her face, around 200 in total, or if you're paying attention, you'll notice that firing into her open mouth leaves her stunned for a moment, and at that point you can choose to roll down her throat and plant bombs in her gullet. This method is faster, as bombs deal much more damage than missiles, but it's also riskier, as Samus takes constant damage whenever she's inside the creature. It's pretty great stuff. After defeating the Queen, the last remaining Metroid, Samus makes her way back to her ship, and on the way finds a lone Metroid egg. It hatches, and as the newborn baby imprints on Samus, the bounty hunter finds she doesn't have the heart to kill it. The baby follows Samus back to her ship, and the two leave together, with mission mostly accomplished. Just like the first game, Metroid 2 has alternate endings depending on how fast the player finished their mission. But once again, the endings only differ in how much of Samus-san's suit the player gets to see. All in all, the game can easily be finished in an afternoon, a weekend at the most depending on how much you get lost. And considering that brisk runtime, Metroid 2 is worth a look. It's hard to say whether or not it's outright better than the first game. The sequel may have better controls and some nice quality of life improvements, but some people may have a preference for the original's more intricate world design. And game design is really what matters at the end of the day. After all, Metroid itself is synonymous with exploratory, non-linear level design, and an entry that minimizes that aspect could be seen as antithetical to what the franchise is. It was an experiment to be sure, and this was still early enough in the franchise's history that they could afford to branch out and try new things. But the bold mindset of the team behind the game to make a portable franchise entry that was not lesser, that was not irrelevant to its larger series as a whole, is an admirable approach, and one more games of its ilk should strive to emulate.
If you were colorblind and had an IQ less than 12, then you wouldn't care which portable you had. Of course, you wouldn't care if you drank from the toilet either.
As opposed to the Game Boy, there isn't much to say about its main competitor, the Sega Game Gear. Released about a year after the Game Boy, the Game Gear was basically a portable Master System, and boasted a full-color backlit screen. It was also roughly the size of a cinder block, ate up its 6 AA batteries in around 4 hours, and saw exactly 0 historically important games. Even as Sega managed to briefly surpass Nintendo in North American sales throughout the early 90s, the Game Gear still failed to come anywhere close to matching the Game Boy's popularity. All that in mind, it's easy in hindsight to dismiss the Game Gear as a flop. But when you take a step back and put everything into perspective, it really wasn't. Yeah, it only sold 10% of the Game Boy's total numbers, but 10% of 100 million units is still 10 million units. That's nothing to scoff at, especially back then, when gaming was a much less mainstream pastime than it is today. Alas, the Game Gear is largely forgotten, mostly due to that 0 important games thing. And yeah, I struggle to think of even one. So, somewhat unfortunately, anytime you see the Game Gear in this video series, it's exclusively going to be to talk about a Sonic game. Since Sega has made a point of re-releasing the entire Game Gear Sonic library at least 3 times over at this point, and I own them in multiple collections by now because of course I fucking do. Shortly after Sonic 1 released on the Genesis and established the character as the company's mascot, Sega decided they wanted Sonic to be available for every console they had on the market to maximize potential sales and build the brand. Development of an 8-bit version of Sonic 1 would be outsourced to a company called Ancient, founded in 1990 by music composer Yuzo Koshiro alongside his mother and sister. The company still exists today, and no joke, announced this year that they have a new Genesis game in the works, but this would be their first and only foray with Sonic, and they would create a downsized version of Sonic 1 for both the Sega Game Gear and the Master System, released in October of 1991. So, how did they do? Honestly, pretty decent. The physics are definitely not a one-to-one of the buttery smooth Genesis version, particularly when Sonic's rolling, but they're a fairly faithful approximation. The 8-bit consoles weren't able to juggle a lot of sprites on screen at once, which means players can no longer recollect their rings after they take a hit, which does result in this version being a tad harder than its console counterpart. And due to being unable to fully recreate the physics of the Genesis game, there's not a single loop-de-loop in this version. I previously described Sonic 1 as being like a midway point between pinball and a Mario game, and in light of the compromises this lesser version of Sonic had to make, it definitely leans more toward the Mario half of that equation. Levels are much flatter, straight lines, with a heavier focus on raw platforming challenges as opposed to maintaining your speed. There's even at least one auto-scroll level, which in a Sonic game feels akin to sacrilege. The game still follows the 3 acts and a boss structure from the Genesis, but with a few minor tweaks. Every third act no longer simply ends with a boss fight, but rather is the boss fight, with just a short sprint with no rings placed on the way, leaving you completely vulnerable to losing a life, and thus making each boss more of a direct test of reflexes and skill than they were in the main game. This, in theory, should serve to make the bosses more interesting, and the bosses here are all completely original, but in actuality, they're all still pretty standard fare and nothing to write home about. The Chaos Emeralds have also been reworked. Rather than being collected from special stages, one Chaos Emerald is hidden somewhere in either Act 1 or 2 of each zone, adding a slight element of exploration to the formula, but really nothing more strenuous or demanding than what you'd see in a Mario level or something. Special stages do still exist, but here are simply a manner of racking up points, 1-ups, and continues. Obviously, the Game Gear wouldn't be able to pull off the rotating mazes of the 16-bit game, but these special stages are still very much in the same spirit as Sonic rolls and jumps through a timed obstacle course full of bumpers, springs, and flippers, often leaving the player to bounce around through the stage, much like in the console counterpart. Like, fuck, just, come on, there's nothing I could do, I'm stuck like this while the timer ticks down, someone help me. There are also a few quirks unique to this version that further separate the game from its older brother, like the way each level opens with this little map of where Sonic is on South Island, which helps to visualize the progress the player has made as they near Robotnik's fortress. Plus, it just looks kinda cute, look at it, it's kinda neat. Or how the shield power-up will carry from act to act and even from zone to zone, as long as you manage to keep avoiding damage. Or how every act, including the boss acts, have exactly 1 extra life to find. Unfortunately, not all of the portable version's quirks are charming. Scrap Brain Zone in this version is basically a puzzle level, being essentially a maze with a plethora of switches, doors, and teleporters to navigate through. The game also really chugs in any instance of being underwater, which makes this version of Labyrinth Zone somehow even more unbearable, despite being overall much lighter on obstacles and enemies. And also, the boss of Bridge Zone somehow managed to kill me despite me having a shield, which I thought was kind of bullshit, but I'm chalking that up to a fluke glitch since I doubt it was by intentional design and it only happened the one time. Between the Master System and Game Gear versions, the latter in particular really suffers from the additional problem of screen crunch. I know that was a complaint I already brought up for the Genesis version, but it is far exacerbated here. The Game Gear's screen resolution was a lot tighter than that of either the Genesis or Master System, leading to a very claustrophobic experience when playing on the handheld. They tried to deal with this by adding these little caution signs whenever the player is about to approach a dangerous gap or obstacle, but it's really just slapping a band-aid on a broken leg at that point. For this reason alone, I'd recommend trying to play the Master System version if possible, but that's pretty much impossible to do in the modern day without resorting to emulation. And I would never condone piracy, right? Luckily, no matter which version you play, you're in for a visual and auditory treat. The bright colors and eccentric background designs of the Genesis game are recreated beautifully on the handheld, and they even carried over Sonic's neat little idle animation. Only 3 levels from the Genesis version return in this one: Green Hill, Labyrinth, and Scrap Brain, with the other 3 being entirely new: Bridge Zone, Jungle Zone, and Sky Base Zone, the last of which has usurped Scrap Brain as the new final stage. Of the 3, Jungle Zone is probably my favorite, but Bridge Zone stands out for its music alone, and oh man, the music. Ancient's founder, Yuzo Koshiro, is largely a music composer, and the gaming and SEGA aficionados in the audience likely recognize his name from a little game called Streets of Rage 2, a game with a famously incredible soundtrack. Despite Sonic on Game Gear sharing 3 zones with its console brother, only 2 music tracks are reused: the title screen and Green Hill Zone. The rest are all original compositions from Koshiro, and every one is catchy as all get out, right down to the ending credits and even the boss theme. Bridge Zone is the one always singled out when talking about this version. But I think we're all sleeping on the Jungle Zone BGM here. Sonic 1 on Game Gear isn't a must-play by any means, but it can be a fun little curio of Sonic's history. And it's always interesting seeing how top-of-the-line, groundbreaking console titles are adapted to less advanced consoles. A practice that would continue with games, and the Sonic franchise in particular, all the way up through the 3DS era. In fact, I think the only reason that practice stopped is because the Switch kind of bridged the gap between portable and console gaming. Sonic 1 on Game Gear is worth checking out if you're a fan, or you're in the hyper-specific scenario of having an hour to kill on a Saturday with nothing to play but a copy of Sonic Adventure DX, Mega Collection Plus, and/or Origins Plus, and somehow decide that none of the other games included in those packages look interesting enough. So, yeah, it's no wonder nobody really talks about this one.